The morning Matthias decided to dig up the old coordinates was the same morning the sky cracked open over Mar del Plata. He didn't notice at first. He was arguing with Pablo. "You said 8 o'clock, Matthias said, not looking up from the paper he'd folded and refolded until its crease lines had become a topographic map of their disagreement. "I said approximately 8, Pablo said. He was eating a factura with the focused serenity of a man who believed breakfast was a constitutional right regardless of circumstance. Approximately isn't. The sound wasn't a boom. It was more like the world clearing its throat. A low, resonant pressure that passed through the walls of the maintenance shed and through the bones behind their eyes and out the other side, leaving behind a faint ringing and the smell of ozone. They both looked at the window. The sky above the coast had developed what Matthias would later describe, in his formal deposition to the committee that no longer existed, as a seam. Like something enormous had pressed too hard against the inside of the atmosphere and the fabric had given slightly. Through the seam, light came in that was not the right color for light. "Huh," Pablo said, and took another bite. The research station at Punta Piedras was not a military facility. It was not a strategic asset. It was 14 people, a diesel generator that had opinions, 3 boats, and a corrugated metal building that sweated in summer. Matthias and Pablo maintained the boats. They were, by any reasonable metric, the 2 least important people present when first contact occurred on a Tuesday in February. This would save their lives, repeatedly. The alien survey vessel. It was called a survey vessel in the transcripts. The aliens themselves called it something closer to the word for administrative tool, descended over the bay with the unhurried confidence of an entity that has never, in its entire evolutionary history, needed to worry about what was waiting on the ground. It was large. Not planet, shadowing large, not movie poster large, but large the way a cargo ship is large when you're standing next to it on the dock. You feel your own scale recalibrate involuntarily and don't entirely get it back. The station's director, a compact woman named Dr. Ferreira, who had survived 3 field seasons in Patagonia and 2 grant review cycles, stepped outside and looked at it for 11 seconds. Then she went back in and began evacuating non-essential personnel. Matthias and Pablo were already gone, not fled. Gone in the sense that they were under the station, in the crawl space where the bilge pump lived, because the bilge pump had been making a sound for 2 weeks that Matthias described as a complaint and Pablo described as impending structural failure, and they had finally been cleared to pull the service panel and investigate. When the evacuation order came through on the radio clipped to Pablo's belt, they were lying on their backs in 2 inches of seawater, with their arms inside a housing that smelled of rust and fish and old decisions. "Did she say evacuate?" Pablo asked. "She said non-essential." "We're essential. We're fixing the bilge pump." "That's essential." They lay there a moment. Above them, through 3 layers of hull and deck, the shadow of the survey vessel settled over the bay. "There's also," Matthias said carefully, "the coordinates." Pablo turned his head to look at him, which was difficult given that his head was currently inside a pump housing. "You're not serious." "My grandfather drew that map in 1987. "Your grandfather also believed the television was reading his thoughts." "He was right about the television. He was probably right about the map." The survey vessel dispatched what its administrative records called surface assessment units. Everyone else called them drones. Though that word didn't quite fit. They were more deliberate than drones, more patient, the way a taxonomist is patient with a specimen jar. They moved in grid patterns over the beach and the town and the water, scanning. Whatever they were scanning for, they were thorough about it. The U.S. military response arrived 4 hours later in the form of 3 helicopters and a frigate that materialized on the horizon with the specific energy of an institution that has been waiting for this moment for 70 years and is determined not to waste it. They established a perimeter around the bay. They broadcast warnings in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. They set up a command post on the coastal road and began the process of not knowing what to do while looking extremely confident about not knowing what to do. This was the second invasion. Matias and Pablo emerged from the crawl space at approximately the same time as the helicopters arrived, crawled out through the service hatch on the station's seaward side, and stood in the thin February sunlight, squinting at a sky that now contained both a vessel the size of a shopping mall and 3 Black Hawks. "Okay," Pablo said. "Yeah," Matias agreed. They looked at the paper in Matias' hand. The crease lines had mostly survived the crawl space. The coordinates were still legible. "The beach is probably restricted," Pablo said. "Probably. They'll have checkpoints." "Almost certainly." Pablo pulled his shirt away from his body where it had stuck. He had seawater in his boots and grease under his fingernails, and the half-eaten factua was still somehow in his jacket pocket, wrapped in its paper bag. He retrieved it and finished it, watching a surface assessment drone float past at about 60 meters altitude, its sensor array rotating with the steady patience of something that has never been told no. "I know a way around the checkpoint," he said. The town had changed, not catastrophically. There were no fires, no rubble, none of the glamour of disaster films. The change was subtler and therefore worse. People stood in their doorways and watched the sky. Cars had stopped in the street, not because of any order, simply because their drivers had gotten out to look up and hadn't gotten back in. The restaurants on the boardwalk were closed, or rather they were staffed and stocked, and their doors were open. But no one was eating, and the waiters stood at the windows with everyone else. Matias had grown up 3 blocks from this boardwalk. He had eaten helado at the corner stand on summer nights when he was 7 years old. He knew exactly how the light fell off the coast at this hour, the way it turned the water from gray to green to something almost bronze in the last 30 minutes before it hit the horizon. He knew the smell of this place. It was the smell of his life, and it was still there, underneath the ozone, underneath whatever the survey drones trailed behind them in the air. "Stop looking up," Pablo said, not unkindly. "It doesn't help. I know, you look up, you stop moving. You stop moving, we don't get there before dark." Matias folded the paper one more time and put it in his shirt pocket against his chest. "You ever think about what's actually down there?" "No. Really, I think about whether the pump housing is going to need a full replacement or if we can patch the manifold seal. I think about whether the director is going to blame us for the bilge situation. I don't think about buried treasure, because thinking about buried treasure is a thing my grandfather did, and my grandfather also believed the television was reading his thoughts." "You said." "He wasn't wrong about the television," Pablo said after a pause. The checkpoint was a U.S. military sawhorse and 2 soldiers in full kit who had the expression of people who had trained for something very large and were now being asked to explain to Argentine civilians that the beach was closed. Pablo and Matias watched it from the far side of a kiosk selling phone chargers and sunscreen. "Okay," Matias said. "Yeah, the drainage channel." "The drainage channel," Pablo confirmed. The drainage channel was not glamorous. It was a concrete culvert that ran from the storm drain behind the seafood restaurant on Avenida Constitution down to the beach, and it was exactly wide enough for a man to move through if that man had made certain decisions about his relationship with dignity. It smelled of everything it had ever collected. Pablo went first because he'd done it before, at age 14, for reasons he had never fully explained to anyone. They came out on the beach 20 meters past the checkpoint, spitting and brushing their knees, and the survey vessel hung above the water a kilometer offshore, and the frigate sat on the horizon, and the light was doing that thing with the water that Matias had been watching all his life. He pulled out the compass his grandfather had given him along with the map. The beach, for its part, was empty, completely empty. The umbrella rentals were folded and stacked against the wall of the changing rooms. The food cart was parked and locked. The sand was clean, all its usual furniture removed, and in that absence it looked the way the beach must have looked a very long time ago, before the city existed, before anyone stood here and named it. A surface assessment drone passed overhead at 30 meters. It did not react to them. It's not looking for people, Pablo said, watching it go. No, it's looking for something else. Yeah. Matthias was walking and watching the compass, the paper unfolded in his other hand. Which is interesting, don't you think? Comes all this way, has the technology to be here, and it's looking for something specific, not cataloging, retrieving. Pablo considered this. Your grandfather's map could be coincidence. Could be. They looked at each other. It's probably coincidence, Matthias said. Probably, Pablo agreed. The X on the map was at the base of the old breakwater, the one that had been partially demolished and rebuilt in the 90s. There was a concrete block there, part of the original structure that had sunk partially into the sand on the seaward side. It had been there since before Matthias was born. Pigeons had opinions about it. Teenagers had painted things on it. It had been background furniture in 100,000 photographs. Matthias stood beside it and looked at the paper, and then at the compass, and then back at the paper. Here, he said. Pablo had acquired a length of rebar from somewhere during their walk. Matthias didn't ask, and now he crouched beside the block and worked it under the edge and leaned. The block didn't move. Together, Matthias said. They worked in silence for a while. The drone had come back around and was doing a second pass of the beach, slightly lower this time. Whatever it was looking for, it was looking harder. The sand came away from the base of the block in chunks, and underneath, in a cavity that the original construction had apparently sealed over decades ago, there was a box. Metal, painted dark green, the size of a shoebox. It had a combination lock on it that was so thoroughly corroded it came off in Matthias's hands when he touched it. He opened the box. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept it almost perfectly preserved, was a device about the size of a hardback book. It was not made of any material Matthias recognized. It was not made of any material anyone on Earth had made in 1987, or in any year before or after that Matthias knew of. It had no buttons and no screen and no visible seams. It was a smooth, matte gray object that hummed, very faintly, at a frequency you felt in your back teeth rather than heard. Pablo looked at it for a long time. Your grandfather, he said. Yeah. The television. Yeah. Above them, the drone stopped moving. It just stopped, mid-flight. It hung there in the February air, 25 meters up, and its sensor array, which had been rotating constantly since they'd first seen one, went still. It was pointing at the box. Put it away, Pablo said quietly, already moving. Where in your shirt? Like the map. Against your chest. He was gathering the oilcloth, repacking the box, kicking sand back over the cavity with his foot. The metal is it's probably in the metal, the box. Put the thing in your shirt and walk. Don't run, walk. Matthias tucked the device under his arm and began walking. The drone resumed its sensor rotation. It descended to examine the box, the cavity, the disturbed sand. It was thorough. They were already at the seawall by the time it finished, and then they were back in the drainage channel, and then they were behind the kiosk, and then Pablo's hands were shaking slightly as he lit a cigarette from a crumpled pack in his jacket pocket, and Matthias was standing with both arms crossed over his chest and the device against his sternum, feeling the hum. Okay, Pablo said. Okay, we can't take that back to the station. No, because if that drone reported back...
It definitely reported back.
Then they're going to look for what the box had in it. I'd assume so. Pablo smoked. Above the rooftops, the survey vessel had moved slightly closer to shore. Somewhere in the direction of the coastal road, the U.S. military was having a conversation on a radio that Matthias was very glad he couldn't hear. My cousin has an apartment on Dorrego, Pablo said. 2nd floor. She's in Cordoba until Easter. Does she have a kitchen? Pablo looked at him. You want to cook. I want to think. I think better when something is happening with my hands. You want to cook while we're holding what is apparently an alien artifact that an alien spacecraft is now looking for. Do you have a better idea? Pablo smoked the cigarette down to the filter. She has a good stove, he said, gas. The old kind. The apartment on Dorrego was small and warm and smelled of the neighbor's laundry and old wood and the particular smell of a place where someone lives comfortably. Pablo's cousin had a shelf of paperbacks and a cactus on the windowsill and a photograph of her graduation pinned to the fridge with a magnet shaped like a tango dancer. The stove was the old kind, as promised. Matthias put the device on the kitchen table and cut onions. They could hear the helicopters in the distance. From the window at an angle, there was a strip of sky visible, and occasionally something moved through it that was large enough to matter. My grandfather said he found it on the beach, Matthias said, sweeping the onions into the pan. 1987. He was fishing, said it came in on a wave. He picked it up because he thought it was electronic equipment from a ship. He said it was warm. Warm. Warmer than the water should have made it. He kept it. He never knew what it was. He made the map because he was afraid to have it in the house. He paused. Because of the television? Right. Pablo was at the table, looking at the device without touching it. It's still warm. Don't touch it. I know, I wasn't going to. A pause. How do you think it got here, originally? I don't know. Lost cargo, maybe. Survey mission that went wrong. Something they dropped and came back for 40 years later. Matthias turned the heat down under the onions. Or maybe it was always a plan. Leave something here, see if it survives, see if anyone picks it up, see what we do with it, a test. Or just data collection. They're not here because of us specifically. They're here because this. He gestured at the device without looking at it. Sent a signal when I picked it up. Dormant for 40 years, and then someone touches it and it wakes up and says, here, here, here. Pablo turned the device over in his mind without touching it. So they're not invading. They're picking up lost luggage. I don't know if the distinction matters. They're here and they're looking, and the Americans are here because the Americans are always here when something large appears in the sky. He plated the onions and started on a second layer. What matters is what we do in the next, I don't know, hours. Before they do a full sweep and find us missing from the evacuation list and start looking for us by name. We could give it back. To which group? Pablo was quiet for a moment. The aliens. We don't speak alien. We don't speak the kind of English they speak at a military checkpoint either. Fair. The kitchen smelled of onions and gas flame. Here's what I keep thinking. They came back for it specifically. They left it here, maybe on purpose, maybe not, and they waited, and when it activated, they came back. That's a long game. 40 years of waiting for a signal. What's the signal mean to them? I think it means we touched it. I think it means someone here was capable of touching it without being frightened of it and taking it home and hiding it for 40 years. He looked over his shoulder at the table. My grandfather kept it, and he didn't tell anyone except me. He made a map instead of throwing it away or turning it in. He decided it was his problem and he would hold on to it and figure it out later. And he never figured it out, but he held on to it. Pablo looked at the device. The device hummed. That's a very human thing to do, Pablo said. I know. Outside, something moved across the gap of visible sky. Not a helicopter. Slower, more deliberate. One of the surface assessment drones, cruising low over the rooftops in its grid. Matthias turned off the stove and sat down across from Pablo. They both looked at the device. It was slightly brighter than it had been. Not lit, not glowing exactly, but the matte gray surface had developed something at its center. A depth, like a window with a light on the other side that hadn't been switched on yet. It knows we're looking at it, Pablo said. I don't know if it has that kind of awareness. Something does. Matthias picked it up. It was warm. Warmer than before, warmer than the table, warmer than his hands. The hum moved up from his teeth into his jaw and then into his chest, which already felt strange because of everything, and for a moment he thought he was going to drop it. His hands tightened involuntarily. He held on. The depth in the device's surface flickered, like a pupil adjusting to light. He thought about his grandfather standing on the beach in 1987 with wet shoes, picking up something that had washed in, deciding to take it home. He thought about the way old men hold things they don't understand. With both hands, with patience, with the quiet stubbornness of someone who has lived long enough to know that most things that seem complicated turn out to have simple answers if you wait long enough. His grandfather had waited 40 years. He hadn't gotten the answer. He'd passed the waiting on. Matthias held the device and he breathed in and out, the same breath his grandfather breathed, the same breath every person on this coast breathed, the same breath the sea air had been carrying for as long as there had been anyone to breathe it. The surface of the device opened, not physically, it didn't unfold or extend, but the depth that had been behind the surface was suddenly not behind it anymore. It was in the room, or the room was in it. Something had changed in the weight of earth around the object and around Matthias's hands. And inside the depth there was information. Not words, not images exactly, but something that arrived in the mind as meaning, a survey marker left by a team that never returned to retrieve it, dormant pending contact, designed to be collected by the native intelligence that located it, if any, carrying a message intended for the first member of the indigenous cognitive class to achieve sufficient contact threshold. He was, apparently, the indigenous cognitive class. He was, apparently, sufficient. "What is it doing?" Pablo said, very quietly. "Talking," Matthias said. His voice sounded strange in his own ears. "I think, in a way, he exhaled. It's a letter, left here a very long time ago, for whoever found it, from the people in that ship, from their predecessors, their ancestors maybe, from whoever it was that passed this system a long time ago and thought, there's something here, something that might be worth checking on, let's leave a marker and see if it's still there when we come back. And you're reading it." Something like that. Pablo sat very still. Somewhere outside, the US military was doing something with vehicles, the sound of engines, the crunch of boots on gravel. Somewhere above, the survey vessel waited with the patience of something that has done a great deal of waiting. "What does it say?" Pablo asked. Matthias looked at him across the kitchen table, across the cooling onions, and the old stove, and the photograph of Pablo's cousin at her graduation, and the cactus in the window, and all the small, dense, ordinary furniture of a human life. "It says we're interesting," he said. "It says whoever made this didn't know if we'd be here, didn't know if we'd pick it up, didn't know if we'd be the kind of thing that holds on to something for 40 years without understanding it and then hands it to someone else and says, 'Here, your problem now.'" He paused. "It says if we're reading this, that means we are. That kind of thing. That's it? There's more technical things. Navigation data. Some kind of, I don't know how to read most of it. But the first part is clear." Matthias set the device down on the table between them. It continued to shine with the depth behind it. They left it to see what we'd do with it. And now they're back to see what we've done. Pablo looked at the device. He looked at Matthias. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the paper bag that had held his factura, unfolded it, smoothed it on the table. "You should write that down," he said. "What you just said, the clear part. Why? Because when we walk out of here, and we're walking out of here, I'm not spending the rest of the contact event in my cousin's kitchen. The pump manifold still needs attention. When we walk out, we're going to talk to someone, eventually. And when we do, you want to have it written down. Because you'll forget a word, or you'll say it differently, and they'll misunderstand, and then suddenly it's a threat instead of a letter." Matthias looked at him. Pablo looked back with the expression of a man who has spent 15 years in ship maintenance, which is to say, the expression of a man who has learned that the difference between a disaster and a manageable situation is usually whether someone wrote the procedure down. Matthias took the paper bag. He wrote on it with the stub of pencil Pablo produced from the same jacket pocket that had produced the cigarette sets and the factura, and apparently an entire survival kit assembled from breakfast items. He wrote, "They left it to see what we'd do. We held on to it, that's the answer." "Okay," Pablo said, reading it. "Good." He stood up. "Now, do you know how to get to the command post on the coast road without using the checkpoint?" "Via the drainage channel." "Via the drainage channel." "Yes." He tucked the paper bag into his own shirt pocket. "Let's go explain humanity to the Americans. They won't like it. Nobody likes it when someone else has the letter." "Exactly." Pablo buttoned his jacket over the paper bag. "Bring the thing." Matthias picked up the device. It was warm in his hands, warm and faintly humming, and the depth behind its surface was still open, still showing the long distance of whatever message it had been carrying all these years. He tucked it under his arm, the same way he'd tucked his grandfather's maps, the same way he'd carried every piece of equipment down every gangway into every boat hold in 15 years of keeping things working that weren't supposed to still be working. They went the stairs of his cousin's apartment building and out into the February afternoon. The survey vessel was still there, over the water, enormous and patient. The frigate was still there on the horizon. The helicopters moved in patterns overhead. The drones moved in their grids. The street was quiet, all the people still in their doorways or watching from windows, and the light was doing the thing it always did at this hour, turning the gap between buildings into something the color of old bronze, the color of the coast, as he had always known it, as it had been before anyone put a city here, and as it would be after. Matthias walked through his city with an alien artifact under his arm, and his friend beside him, and the smell of onions still on his hands, and he felt, not for the first time in his life and not for the last, that the particular human talent for continuing onward in the presence of absolutely unreasonable circumstances was not a failure of imagination. It was the whole point. At the checkpoint, the soldier held up his hand. Matthias stopped. Pablo stopped. The drone that had been running its grid above the street came lower, then lower. Then it stopped again, the way the beach drone had stopped, sensor array still, pointing at the device under Matthias's arm. The soldier looked at the drone. The soldier looked at Matthias. The soldier looked at the device. "Sir," he said. "I need to speak with whoever is in charge," Matthias said in his careful English. "I have something that belongs to the people in that ship, and I have a letter they left. And I am going to need you to not take either of those things away from me, because I am the indigenous cognitive class, apparently, and I think they want to hear from me specifically." The soldier stared at him. Pablo helpfully produced the paper bag. "It's written down," Pablo said. They stood there in the bronze light of the Feb afternoon, two maintenance workers from the Punta Piedra station with grease under their fingernails and seawater in their boots, and all of human history in their chest pockets, and above them the survey vessel held its position and waited, as it had been waiting for a very long time. For exactly this. The soldier got on his radio. Matthias looked at Pablo. Pablo looked back. "The bilge pump," Pablo said. "I know. We're going to have to file an incident report for missing the maintenance window." "I know. Ferreira is going to be furious." "She is," Matthias agreed. "I'll write that down too."